pulling it together. Welcome to the first SNR seminar for fall. What year is this? 2022. So yeah, we're psyched to have a great speaker today. I guess a couple of announcements if I can remember what I'm supposed to announce. Yeah, since this is our first one, I guess the first thing I'll say is we're going to do this just about every Wednesday at 3:30 and mostly in person. I think there's 1 week in September where it'll be a Zoom only. So just stay tuned to the announcements. Most of them will be here. All of them will be on Zoom and one will be on Zoom only. Next week, we have another speaker from out of town, Robbie Motar, and I believe the title of the talk is Why Soils Matter. So hopefully you can join us for that. I believe we've got the seminar class in attendance, or at least some of them. The sign up is with Chris there. So please make sure that you get credit for signing up, and I'm sure you know the drill. Yeah, I honestly can't remember if there's anything else to announce, so we'll just go forward. And so I'll introduce our speaker, which is Dr. Justin Dellinger from California, a friend and colleague of mine. I actually don't know where he got his undergrad, but I do know that he got his master's at Auburn studying red wolves and his PhD at the University of Washington studying interactions, I believe, between wolves, mule deer, white-tailed deer, and mountain lions.
Just wolves.
Okay, wolves and deer. After that, actually, I think maybe during that, but right before he finished, he got an opportunity to work for California Department of Fish and Wildlife as a carnivore research scientist studying carnivores. And one of the things he did was really be the lead mountain lion researcher for the state of California for 6+ years. And I had met Justin before through wolf stuff and at conferences, but that's where we came back into contact. And I think what was really cool about the work Justin did with CDFW was, as you'll see, I think in his talk today, he'll give us probably a good taste of some of the work that was done. But he really provided some impressive leadership to bring together all the many people that do mountain lion research and have done mountain lion research in California. And so instead of 17 research groups over the years working in their individual study areas and not talking to each other, Justin organized meetings every year and got us all in the same room. And it's led to a lot of really cool collaborations. And we're starting to look beyond our individual study areas and do work on mountain lion ecology at the statewide level. And I'm sure that's going to be a big part of what Justin talks about today. So really cool stuff, very collaborative. And I think with that, I'll just turn it over to Justin.
All right. Thank you, John. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. So a few clarifications. First off, I'm not from California. I don't know that I will ever consider myself a native there, but as we'll detail, it's got some interesting aspects to it from a wildlife standpoint. Another clarification, as John mentioned, is that a lot of this work is pretty much all of this work is hugely collaborative. I'm up here talking about it, but really what you're seeing is the work over many years and many different research groups and entities all working together and collaboratively bringing their data sets together. Also, again, this is just sort of a snapshot of the research. There's a lot more that is to come that I've been a pleasure to collaborate with John on, as well as his PhD student Kyle, to bring more of this stuff to the forefront, to the published literature for management and conservation. And I think there is some application, obviously, to California, but also to other areas like maybe Nebraska that's experiencing sort of a reestablishment of mountain lion populations. This picture is kind of one of my favorite ones because a lot of people, this kind of typifies California and mountain lions. I caught this animal, and within a week, he's staring through the glass of somebody's house cat and wanting to eat that house cat. But it's not just concrete and asphalt and stuff, as we'll talk about. But I do think it's kind of quintessential what people think about. All right, so a little bit of a background for where we're talking about. So here's California. when people think of California, they mainly just think about Hollywood, LA, and the Golden Gate Bridge and stuff. But we're talking about a place that's over 2 times as big as the state of Nebraska, so huge. But it's also got 20 times the number of people, so roughly 40 million people. They generally are concentrated in 2 areas, so the South Coast here, LA, San Diego, and then the Bay Area. Outside of that, it's relatively low population. The only other thing really is Sacramento area. So you do have a lot outside of those urban areas. And here's just a little bit different way to view it. So the red is, developed areas. You got the major roads there, and then ag. A lot of people don't know California is one of the largest ag producing states in the country, and the whole what we call the Central Valley here. A lot of agricultural production, kind of, similar to parts of Nebraska, maybe not with the crop types, but just the focus on ag. One interesting thing is there you've got all those people. There is more public land in California than there is the entire state of Nebraska. So, basically in all these different colored areas, you got BLM, National Forest, National Park. All of that combined is bigger than the state that we're in right now, which is, in my opinion, a pretty sizable state in and of itself. So you get this really stark contrast between urban population centers and really rural / wilderness areas that provides for a lot of great opportunity and natural processes like lions eating bighorn, and in some areas lions themselves being the problem for conservation, eating listed bighorn species. Continuing just with the background, this is a big state, it's pretty complex. The topography is also something to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about mountain lions. Again, you got this big Central Valley here where it's all pretty flat, was drained and levied for ag purposes. You got the Sierras here, this big spine, and the desert, the Mojave Desert way out here, and this coast area, which is sort of the Mediterranean type climate. And then up in here you got the redwoods. So yeah, really diverse, ecologically diverse state. To try and simplify that a little bit, here's just a really broad stroke look at the ecoregions in the state, where it talks, the desert, the semi-desert, the Sierra forests, and all that. So again, just trying to set the stage here and demonstrate that this is a pretty dynamic setting that we're talking about. Areas with lots of people, areas with no people, areas that are heavily developed, areas that aren't, and everything in between. Now, some interesting, I guess not really themes, just things to keep in mind that I've been mulling over in my mind the last few years is these, topics that I'd like to keep in mind and, would love greater discussion on later. In wildlife, one of the things that we have historically done is just what I call a head count. We go and estimate population size, and based on that, we consider things good or bad or kind of par for the course. But, from this, think about what metrics should we use to assess wildlife population status? Should it always be a head count, and that's sort of all we look at? Also, are there singular things that we can do to influence multiple aspects of a population? There's sort of this domino effect. Are there opportunities for that? And then, broadly speaking, what kind of relationships are beneficial for ensuring wildlife population persistence? In this instance, mountain lions. But I think this really comes to the forefront. This topic comes to the forefront when you talk about how many people there are in California and how much public land there is in California. So it's bringing together these two, I guess in some people's mind, like diametrically opposed positions, where you got a lot of people and a lot of land. So who all should be considered to be at the table for decision making and conservation? All right. So again, we're going to talk really broadly. And anytime you're working on something, that covers an entire state and a species that's elusive like mountain lions, you can really go down some rabbit holes. So I'm going to try and avoid that, but just sort of hit these high points, and hopefully I can do a good job of tying all the different things together. So at first, we're going to talk about demographics, and within that, we're going to talk about, obviously, the two main things that come to mind: density and survival. However, we'll start off with just a brief history of mountain lion management in California and how that might have shaped the demographics. Interestingly enough, California at one point employed 5 people, and their entire job was just to go out and remove mountain lions. They got paid, really good money to do this, and they got really good at it. They got so good at it that they actually worked themselves out of a job. Over this period, I want to say California paid out about 12,500 bounties for mountain lions over that period. That's a lot of dead animals. I don't care what species you're talking about, especially for a naturally low density predator. Then things started to change, and they changed really quickly. So from 63 to 69, they were a non-game mammal. So basically you could shoot one, you could take one, there was no bag limit, but there was also no financial incentive. I should point out that during the bounty period, the bounty was so incentivized that during the Great Depression, if you killed one mountain lion, you could go to the courthouse and get $30 for the skin of that animal. $30 during the Depression was a huge amount of money. So it was greatly incentivized. Shortly after that non-game period, where it was just sort of a free-for-all, but there was no incentive, they were briefly a game mammal. So there was actually two years in California where there were hunting tags issued, and about 120 animals were taken during that season. And again, this ever-changing thing. Then, it was Governor Ronald Reagan at the time signed into legislation or into law this bill that for a season protected mountain lions. That legislation had to be renewed every so often, and basically it classified mountain lions as a protected mammal until more data could be gathered. And that legislation actually sunset for a very short period of time in 1986, at which point they reverted back to a game mammal, but they tried to get hunting back on the books. But then what happened is the public got involved. They actually had a public vote in 1990 where they put it to the citizens of California: do you want to hunt mountain lions or not? And to no surprise, it passed overwhelmingly that people did not want to have a mountain lion hunt. And they've tried to repeal it several times, but essentially the way that the bill is set up, it's pretty much never going to be repealed. It either takes a greater than 50% vote from the public to repeal it, or a 4/5 vote in the legislature, which that'll never happen either. So essentially, we're at this place where mountain lions are uniquely classified as a specially protected mammal in California, and have been now for a little over 30 years. Now, while a lot of people might say that's great, how are most Fish and Wildlife agencies set up to understand their wildlife populations? They sell a tag or a hunting license and then get that money, turn that money back around to research wildlife populations. Well, with no money coming in from hunting tag sales, there's no ability to understand what that population is doing. So for a little period of time, we really didn't have any understanding of what was going on with the mountain lion population. And it sort of left it to a lot of different people to try and cobble together an understanding. At the same time that all this was going on, here's what the human population is doing. Y'all probably seen that on the news, the big bustling cities. And again, we didn't have a whole lot of data. So what I've tried to do, and some of the more experienced modelers in here, like John, will probably just shake their heads if I told them how I actually put this together. But it passed peer review. I won't. But basically, I took all of the removal data that we had, so all the bounty data, all of the depredation data, and tried to look at a retrospective population model of what we could say the mountain lion population has been doing. And what you can see is like during the bounty period, we got a pretty decent idea of what that population was probably doing, and that's crashing. But then since all that bounty data came in and not having any hunter tag return data coming in, we couldn't say what was going on with the population. You would figure that it was increasing, but we really don't know. There's some point estimates here at different points in time by different researchers. But basically the point is for a period of time, we really had no clue what the population was doing. And so basically I originally came to California with the intent of estimating the population size of mountain lions statewide. And from there, it kind of snowballed and went a whole bunch of different directions. Now, catching mountain lions is probably one of the funnest things that a person can do, but it's also very expensive. It takes a lot of, overcoming a lot of logistical challenges. A good effort at catching mountain lions is probably somewhere like one a week. And in that, you're still working every day probably. So, while you think going out and estimating population size, that's great, I'm gonna get to catch a bunch of animals. It's not financially or logistically feasible to do that across a state as big as California. So basically what we set out to do is to try and compare these invasive methods of what I'll call collar and faller with some non-invasive approaches, and try and then use that going forward for population estimation across the whole state. And for non-invasive methods, we pretty much tried to rely on the scat detection dogs. They're pretty much like a bomb dog or a drug dog. And it takes a lot less training to teach a dog to sniff out cat poop than it does a drug dog or anything like that. If any of y'all have your own dogs, they definitely like this stuff. So here's what we did. 12 different areas across the state we went, and in most of these areas we both collared animals as well as deployed the scat detection dogs to estimate populations. Now the nice thing about having the collared animals on the landscape is when we captured and radio collared them, we were able to take a DNA sample, and that serves almost like as a local reference, genetic library for what we know is out there, like a minimum known of what we know is on the landscape. And then when we take the scat, we get a genetic fingerprint from that as well. We can compare that to our reference library of known animals and see, how many of those known animals are we accounting for, and thus how good is our non-invasive method working. So, just as an example, we'll zoom in right here. This is the Central Coast, really beautiful area. Nice Mediterranean habitat. I think it's a lovely 110 right now there. So pack your bags and go. So here we go, zooming in. Here's all of the radio collared animals that we collared in that period. It was about a month's time to collar these animals, so we did actually have a higher capture rate than normal. The background is just sort of probability of use for habitat. Then we layered on the scat dogs on top of that. So we just gridded off the landscape. The blue are sort of the survey routes that the dogs took, and the yellow are where they found samples. And looking a little bit more fine scale at that, you can see that basically what we're trying to hit is like right in here, hit drainages and saddles. Like here's a saddle right down here. Hitting ridge lines and where ridge lines come together, things that facilitate, predator, specifically mountain lion movement on the landscapes, saddles, ridge lines, and drainages. And what we found from that is honestly, we did a really good job of detecting the known animals on the landscape. If land access was really good, which in most places it was, we were detecting anywhere from 75 to 80% of our known animals. And generally we were detecting a lot more animals that we didn't even know about, although we hadn't even documented. So it was pretty cool. Now, what we then decided to do, we had this huge, because of this effort, we had this huge collar database as well. Going out and capturing radio collaring all these animals. we not only were able to get genetic samples off of them, we put collars on them and we're collecting collar data as well. And so we tried to use that in sort of an integrated population model, because not only did we have genetic capture recapture from the scat, but we also had the telemetry data to inform some of the spatial analyses for that. And so here you can see just the importance of that. So on this side we've got you know, our estimates and the standard errors for some of our variables that were most informative. So you got primary productivity, latitude, and then the interaction. And you can see that that telemetry data really shrunk the you know, the error bars on those. So you know, makes sense. An animal that's low density like this, that's hard to get a lot of data. Even with our scat, our recapture rate was still like 2.5, which is pretty low. So using as much data as you can is really important, and that spatial data really helped account for the variability in density. What we found, again, it was pretty simple. Just two variables primarily were driving density. Not surprisingly, density scaled pretty strongly with primary productivity. So the more productivity you have, the more deer you have, the more lions you have. And then latitude. And latitude was kind of counterintuitive. You know, as latitude increased, we found increasing density. I think that's probably just because the southeastern portion of the state is all Mojave Desert, where lions don't exist really. So I think that's sort of why you're getting a little bit of that effect in there. And what we got was sort of this range where, so you get you know, basically decreasing density as you leave the coast, productivity highest along the coast. Overall, across the state, if we were to average it, what we found is you know, 1.5 animals per 100 square kilometers. And when I say 1.5, I want to be clear, what we're probably picking out there is adults and subadults. With the scat surveys, you're probably not coming across, you know, kitten scat a lot. They're pretty stationary on the landscape. So you got to get pretty lucky to stumble across kittens and any kind of scat that they deposited. And here's sort of an overall abundance of individuals across the state. Again, I don't consider that a census. That's more just like say 10 to 12-month-old animals and greater. And you know, the abundance stuff is great, but survival is also really important when we're talking about demographics. And this is a lot of the work that I've been working with John and Kyle on that I'll briefly talk about. So, gosh, I want to say it was what, John, like 600 animals or something like that that we had data on for doing some survival analyses. And what we determined is that, you know, annual survival was honestly pretty good for the females, lower for males, but that's not surprising, you know, given that males just are more readily getting themselves in places that they probably shouldn't be. This was interesting as well. You know, human mortality we definitely found was additive. And what I mean by additive is that as human mortality increased, natural mortality, you know, was still, you know, either unchanging or still increasing. So something important when you're managing a population. Not only was it additive, but it was 2 times as much as the natural mortality. So we, you know, you have management removal here. So basically, by management, there's no hunting season, but you could still get a permit to remove a mountain lion if, say, it killed your cow or something like that. The other large human source of mortality was vehicle strikes. So, you know, in places where, say, there's not a lot of livestock or a lot of animals to kill, there's probably more roads that animals can get whacked on. So, so yeah, those 2 sources of mortality were definitely pretty influential. So, not surprisingly, survival was highest in the wilderness areas. You know, less people, less chance for them to get in trouble. So, so things were well. What was interesting is that survival wasn't lowest in the urban areas like you might expect, you know, where there'd be tons of people, lots of roads and stuff. Survival was lowest in what we call these low density developed areas. They're essentially just rural areas. And this is important to keep in mind. some of the locations of what I consider these low density developed areas. You got like the foothills of the Sierras here. You got the Central Coast, parts of the North Coast, and then down here in the South, that's called what we call the Peninsula Range. But those general areas, I'll try if I can remember to circle back to those later. But you know, these low density developed areas, survival was markedly lower than in the other areas. Now, what influenced that survival? Well, you know, males were more likely to die, as indicated by the annual survival rates. Adult animals, not significant, but did appear to have higher survival rates than subadults. Also, not surprising. You know, low density development, you know, didn't help. But what was really impressive and I wouldn't say surprising, just interesting to be able to demonstrate, was that human perception was one of the primary drivers of survival rates. So if people had more of a negative slant on mountain lions and mountain lion management, then animals in those areas would likely have lower survival rates. And, you know, there's plenty of ways that you can imagine that you know, that manifesting itself. But one of the ways is that people, if they experience the loss of one of their, you know, livestock or domestic animals, would be more willing to try and get a permit to then lethally remove that animal. So, you know, really fascinating, and you know, something to keep in mind that human attitudes and perceptions are really an important part of wildlife management. So, wrapping up the demographic section here, you know, John and Kyle might disagree with me, but overall, the density and survival isn't that concerning to me from a statewide perspective. Sure, there's specific areas where we might have some concerns, but overall, not terribly concerning. And keep in mind, the first point that I talked about is what metric do we use to monitor or to, you know, consider the status of a population. The other thing that's interesting is from the survival analyses, we can say that both physical and abstract aspects of humanity strongly influence survival. So the low density development, that's a physical attribute of the landscape that you can more readily quantify, but then human viewpoints and perception, more of an abstract thing that definitely had an influence on survival. You know, sometimes not intuitive that those things would have an impact. And then, you know, with that in mind, instead of, you know, not always getting to go out and do the cool hands-on research, sometimes to really have an impact, you need to consider those more abstract things like human attitudes if you want to have a management or conservation impact. All right, so now moving on, the genetics. This is probably what people have heard the most about with mountain lions in California, but if not, I'll give you a brief overview of it. So we're going to talk about population structure and then just sort of source sink dynamics. So really briefly, source sink, we think about that a lot in terms of demographics, wildlife demographics, but it's also very much a thing with genetics. So source, you figure you got a big population, there's a big block of high quality habitat, a lot of individuals, and they're connected via dispersal to, you know, either smaller patches of habitat with less individuals or just patches of habitat that are lower quality that can't support as many individuals. But the hope is that, you know, all of these different populations are connected. Source and sink, one isn't better than the other. That's just what is. That's just sort of a natural phenomenon on the landscape with, you know, with wildlife management. So, but sorry, there's a lot to this. So hopefully I can detail it all. So with that in mind, we took genetic samples from all over the state. You're looking at just short of 1,000 samples, and we use Nevada for reference, and also just to make Nevada feel good. They kind of get left out a lot. So we took 1,000 DNA samples from 1,000 mountain lions from all across the state, including Nevada. Most of these animals we got from study animals. You capture an animal, you take a blood sample. Some of them we got from animals that were lethally removed on a permit, and others that were hit by a car. We did some pretty high level genetics beyond my comprehension. I can briefly swim in that pool, but it gets deep fast for me. So what we found is, pretty heavy population structure. You're looking at 10 different population or 10 different genetic clusters here. And, there's some things that jump out at you. One is that there's some natural population structure. Right here, the line that differentiates the eastern and western Sierra, that's just the crest of the Sierras. There's pretty much no deer up there. It's just rock and ice. So there's no reason for a mountain lion to go there. And so that natural landscape barrier is helping to structure populations. But also what you have is you've got localized structuring or small scale population structuring here in these urban population centers. And I put this up here just to help remind you of where all the people are, where all the roads are, and what the landscape looks like. So here around LA, you get pretty heavy population structure around all these roadways and everything else. And the same in the Bay Area. And now what we've learned is that the Western Sierra here is it's a source for the entire state. It's a genetic source. If you pull the Western Sierra out, or if you localize it or isolate it in and amongst itself, the rest of the state kind of crumbles. So you have to keep all of the populations in some way, shape, or form connected to the Western Sierra. Just something to keep in mind. And the Central Coast here, we know also is like a local source for the Bay Area and Southern California. So something to keep in mind there. When we did all of this, we derived some genetic metrics. Heterozygosity, you want that to be high. Relatedness, you want that to be low. And then effective population size. Now, there's some disagreement, but the thought is that for large mammals like mountain lions, which you want that effective population size to be about 50 or more. And really what the effective population size is essentially just how many individuals in that area are contributing, genetically speaking, to the next generation. It's not saying that that's how many adult animals there are in the population. It's just based on the genetic diversity. Here's how many animals are likely contributing to the next generation. So I'll point out some things here. So the Western Sierra here, we look like we're in pretty good shape. We got high heterozygosity, low relatedness, and effective population size well above 50. And then in the Santa Anas, which is this bright blue here just along the coast, we got pretty low heterozygosity. The only other population that's been documented lower is the Florida panther. We've got pretty high internal relatedness, so everybody's related to one another, and effective population size that's well below 50. And what you get when you start to have these values is you get things like this, signs of inbreeding. And not only this, but you get other physical attributes, males with only one testicle, or you get heart deformations and things like that. So we are starting to see in some of these populations actual physical manifestations of inbreeding as well. But again, these are localized in localized places on the landscape. Now, to paint it even more, and I've already talked about this a little bit, here's just like a PCA, a graph of a PCA analysis showing how they're all related. So you can see that everything is tied back to the Western Sierra, the Peninsular Range down south, and then the Santa Anas indirectly. And then you got all the coast here that's tied back to the Western Sierra. So again, it's sort of like a deck of cards. If you pull out that one card, the whole thing will fall down. So the Central Coast right here and the Peninsular Range are local sources, but they still all tie back to the one main source. And that's important to keep in mind because remember, the Western Sierra was a place where you had that low density development where survival was lowest. So you got this situation where genetically, this is your source population, but because of various human related aspects, it's an area with low survival. It's hard for a place to act as a genetic source if it's got low survival. So something to keep in mind moving forward. All right, so briefly wrapping up the genetics, we do have some regional genetic concerns. It's not all rosy everywhere. like with some of the demographic stuff, there are legitimate concerns in Southern California and the Bay Area, like the Santa Cruz Mountains. As I mentioned, improving survival in source populations could improve genetics in the sink populations. And the way that that plays out is, we think about mountain lions, they exhibit these pretty long distance dispersal events, especially the male animals. If for a source population to act as a source, dispersing animals have to be able to get from it to the sink populations. Well, the young males, if they don't survive long enough to get to those sink populations, then they're not able to disseminate their genetics to these areas. And then also, thinking beyond demographics of what metrics should we look at? It suggests that genetics are an important metric for assessing wildlife population status. Maybe not the only metric, but is an important metric. And, some stuff that John and Kyle and I have been talking about, some further population modeling, trying to wrangle some of the genetic data to include in future regional and statewide modeling. All right, we're working our way through. Hopefully everybody's still with me. How am I doing on time, John? All right, I can do it. All right, habitat connectivity. Honestly, this is the simplest with the math and the analytics, and it's my favorite. So it's the one that makes the most sense to me. All right, so here's California again. Part of what we did is we took data from a lot of the collared animals, not only that I collared for the statewide density work, but that a lot of the other researchers collared for their own individual efforts. Here you see home ranges for about 270 animals across the state. And then what we did is we looked at habitat suitability across the state. What we found is there's a ton of habitat in suitable habitat in California. Roughly 40 to 50% of the state is considered suitable mountain lion habitat. But that's about, I want to say 175,000 square kilometers of suitable habitat. Then what we did is I overlaid some of that genetic clustering onto the suitable habitat. And just for an example, here's what's protected, that dark shaded. About 50% of the suitable habitat is protected. You could be a glass half full or a glass half empty person, either one. And here's some of those metrics. So you've got the different populations here. Here's how much suitable habitat is in each. And just for fun, I put up the percent protected and all that just for people to look at. Again, we'll go with the Western Sierra and the Santa Anas. You've got a lot of protected, or a lot of habitat, a lot of it's protected. In the Santa Anas, you also have a lot of habitat protected, but you don't really have a lot of habitat to start with. Now, really simple, a linear regression with like 9 data points. It doesn't get any simpler than this. So basically, what we did is the amount of suitable habitat on the x-axis in each of those populations, and then their effective population size, which I showed a few slides back. R squared of 0.97, I don't think I can make up data that does that good of a job at holding that strong of a relationship. So, essentially from this, we felt pretty strong in being able to put some thresholds like, okay, how much habitat do we need to have that effective population size of 50 or more? And it comes out to around 15,000 square kilometers of contiguous habitat, which, could be a lot, could be a little, depending on your perspective. Here's how each of those populations pans out. You got the Western Sierra and the North Coast, they're all good. And not only that, but they have a lot of habitat that's protected. The Central Coast right here, it's above that threshold, but there's not a lot of that habitat that's protected. So it could fall below this threshold with future development. And then you got these down here, which are like your problem children. The Eastern Sierra is over here as well, but for reasons I won't go into for time limits, it's kind of a natural sink in my opinion. And 98% of the land is protected. So there's really not a whole lot from that standpoint. All right, so closing up this section, we've got more mountain lion habitat than any other state by my estimation, which is great. However, given the fragmentation that we have, the fragmentation issues, the major roadways, this not only confirms the genetic concerns, it also expands them. You know, the Central Coast, as I mentioned, currently we don't have any genetic concerns. However, if there's further development in that area, you could see further fragmentation in other areas of the state. So it does expand the concerns that the genetics originally pointed out. I talked about this threshold already. And also, one thing, maybe a little bit tangential to this, remember I said 50% of the habitat is protected, but the other 50% is on private land. So it really warrants, you know, strong consideration of working with private landowners. You know, keeping ranches economically viable is much more beneficial to mountain lions than if that ranch goes under, because in California, real estate dollars, you just can't compete with them. Conservation dollars will never be able to compete with them. So if that ranch goes under, a developer is going to buy it up, and then it's going to become subdivisions and housing. It's much more valuable to mountain lions and all wildlife in general, like, you know, as a working landscape, than if it's bought up and subdivided. So working with private landowners, in my opinion, is going to be key. The last thing I'll go through really quickly here. So again, just bringing you back to this, you know, we think the population declined, and we think it might have increased since, you know, the 60s. And here's what the human population has been doing. Well, let me see here. So, you know, but we're also seeing a lot more of this. And, you know, it's kind of counterintuitive, but maybe it's the human population growth and the lion population growing at the same time that could be exacerbating increased conflict. You get more fragmentation on the landscape along with a growing lion population. You just get more lions and more people living side by side. And here's some of our conflict data. Ignore this gap here. That's basically what we call transitioning to the 21st century, going from paper permits to electronic permits. And so one guy retired, and all of the paper permits that he had wound up in the trash. So it's funny how human, you know, things like that can make its way into your data set. But basically, overall, what we're seeing is a positive increase in conflict over time. And again, we do think that there was an increasing lion population over this time period. There's also been increasing fragmentation, an increase in people, say, leaving the city and setting up their little ranchettes out in the woods. 75% of all the depredations are sheep and goats. So, yeah, overwhelmingly the most common. Interestingly, we only get like maybe 10 confirmed calf depredations a year across the entire state. And there are I don't know Nebraska numbers, but there are a ton of cattle in California. So there's a lot of opportunity. This is an important aspect for the genetics and the survival. Young males, those dispersing animals that are trying to find their way on the landscape, are most often the ones that are depredating. They're not sure where the local deer herds are. They're just trying to settle in. So they're taking the easiest thing they can find, which a lot of the times is the goat tied up in someone's backyard to a tree. So, but what's driving the depredation? Well, this is the only figure I'll show for that. But we did find in this analysis that ag was negatively associated with conflict. And that makes sense. A rancher has a financial incentive to ensure that his animals don't get eaten. So he's going to do a better job of protecting those animals. But one of the things that we found is that the number of animals removed in previous years was positively related to the number of conflicts in the following year. At the clip of about an 11% increase for every animal removed in 1 year, there was an 11% increase in conflict the following year. Now, obviously, there has to be a plateau to this. You can't just keep killing mountain lions and more keep coming back. You have to be in an area that's like large contiguous habitat. And what the mechanism for that basically is you take one animal, whether it's an adult or a subadult, and it's trying to hold a place on the landscape, especially the adults. If you pull that animal off the landscape, it's going to act as a sink and you know, create an open space that subadult animals trying to establish territories are all going to be competing for and trying to fill in. And they're all going to be ignorant and not knowing where the local deer are at first. So kind of interesting in that the traditional approach appears to exacerbate conflict. And also that traditional approach could be limiting or could be causing or exacerbating the genetic issues as well, as we're seeing. We really honestly have no understanding of efficiency of deterrent tools. However, we do know that mostly it is these smaller scale, what I'll call hobby farmers, that have a small number of animals. What we've basically resorted to is just telling people to put your animals up at night in something with a roof. You know, that doesn't work for everybody. You know, if you got 500 head of sheep, that doesn't work for you. But this represents well over 70% of the depredation instances is just a goat in someone's backyard. There have been some policy changes, you know, trying to take a 3 strikes approach and not issuing a permit on the first instance. However, with that policy change, not surprisingly, there's been less reporting. So people are getting fed up, you know, whatever they might be doing. I don't think the lions are killing less sheep and goats, but people are reporting it less and probably just dealing with it in their own way. So though there was a proactive approach to address the depredation issue, it might not be helping. And this highlights the need for education and outreach, again, consideration of that human component. All right, so really wrapping it up here. So we've sort of got a mixed bag. You know, demographics look pretty good. Genetics, habitat, connectivity, there are regional concerns. And then conflict and coexistence could, or conflict could exacerbate some of the other concerns. How about this? Improvement in individual areas. Well, if we decrease conflict, we can increase survival and then improve gene flow. Easier said than done. Thinking about it a different way, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Restoring connectivity, you know, with these bridges, overpasses, those kinds of things, or even just fencing along roadways could possibly increase survival and improve gene flow. Then lastly, this one probably the most important, although I probably haven't done a great job of detailing it. This is huge. Just engaging the general public, as we've seen from the survival data, can have huge impacts on demographics. Engaging local landowners and local government, like developing ordinances around animal husbandry, can help mitigate conflict. You know, engaging private landowners as well as NGOs like conservancies, you know, like TNC, buying up lands and helping to keep lands intact, can improve habitat and genetics. Additionally, you know, I can speak for myself. Before I got into this work, I didn't really see the need for genetics. I didn't see the need for human dimensions. I just wanted to honestly to go out and do field work and to do the demographic type stuff, the more traditional work. But honestly, you know, really starting to see the need, even within the wildlife community, of you know, additional involvement with others, with additional expertise. And sometimes you just need a little bit of tailgate talk with anybody, or you know. So yeah, summary. We'll get through this. Sometimes no one metric is suitable to indicate population status. Sometimes you got to look at look more broadly. Improvements in one area, you know, can improve or allow for improvements in other areas, and collaboration across viewpoints. And just to demonstrate the collaboration across viewpoints, this is probably my favorite slide, and it's the last one. You know, working with people like the Farm Bureau, the Wool Growers Association, Wildlife Services, and they are equally as important as you know, some of the land trust groups or some of the conservation-minded groups. It takes reaching across the aisle, I think, to complete some of these more complex, larger level conservation and management issues. So anyway, I hope I did a good job encapsulating all that. I could keep talking for a long time, but you know, happy to take any questions and stuff on the subject. Go ahead, Brian.
All right, great. Well, we may as well give Justin a round of applause before we get the questions. But yeah, great talk. Yeah, we'll open it up to questions. I think we've Probably got some people on Zoom, so we can do a mix of, and we'll start with in person, but we can do some Zoom questions too if we have time. So I'll come around and bring the mic if anyone's got them.
Are there any opportunities for UNL students to possibly go to UC Davis or any other California university to do research on mountain lions?
Yeah, I mean, we do have the opportunity for, you know, people to volunteer, you know, in what ways they can. You know, there's obviously all the paperwork, you know, liability, stuff like that. Yeah, I'm sure that there's ways. We do have volunteers that are at UC, that, you know, undergrads at UC Davis that are volunteering, helping in things. There's not always like hands-on, you know, say in the field ways that people can help, but there's many ways that people can be of benefit, whether it's processing samples in the lab. You know, I know Kyle's going to need tons of help with that here in the near future, and work that will directly benefit all of this. Processing camera photos, we've got a big, you know, big effort that we're wanting to get started up that would, you know, using other non-invasive methods to assess population status. So yeah, there's a diversity of ways that people can get involved, both directly, you know, say in the field, as well as indirectly, you know, in the lab and that kind of thing.
Yep.
In what ways has the state of California tried to contrast the effects of human populations on a lot of like habitat mountain lions, so like fencing along roadways, wildlife overpasses and stuff, to kind of help the genetic pool increase or diversify as humans impact that mountain lion range?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you listed some of the things that they've tried to do, you know, directional fencing, really trying to do intensive data collection efforts in these areas to look at possibly where wildlife crossing structures could be built. I'm sure plenty of people have read, you know, about the Liberty Canyon crossing that's being built right now across the 101. I think it's going to be the largest one in the world.
That's what they say.
That's what they say.
100% sure if that's true, but that's what everyone says.
I've got no prior knowledge on the subject, so I can't argue the point. But yeah, things like that. Problem, obviously, these crossing structures are pretty expensive. That one was funded completely with private dollars. I think mean, Caltrans is doing the work, but the money that's paying them was all privately raised and donated. There is some stuff in the works right now with the legislature to mandate Caltrans, which is sort of the state transportation agency, to mitigate for these things more readily. You know, anytime, and not just in instances where there's already a highway improvement project going on, but to proactively, when they're building a road, put a crossing structure in there. And it's not always for mountain lions. Like there's places where they're being pressured to do this for like salamander migrations, you know, where they from winter to summer go from vernal pools to other areas. So some legislative mandates, you know, and bills being passed to try and address those things. So that kind of thing. There's the conflict stuff, you know, addressing you know, conflict with changes to policy and how permits are issued. That has, in my opinion, hit some bumps in the road, just because that requires the public to report it. But offering like carbon credits and stuff to industries that, you know, say buy up and set aside landscapes for wildlife. And so yeah, they've had several different approaches to it.
Other questions?
On that map where you showed the population, I guess, structures,
Yep.
the genetic structures of mountain lions you had color coded. There are three very small, kind of unique or individual structures in the greater Los Angeles area. Is that human caused, or is there a landscape reason for that?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, you're talking about these three? Yeah. So here, let me back up. Right here. So yeah, this is the Santa Monica's. You know, John's been heavily involved with work there. And essentially what you get is the 101 right here that's basically cut off this tiny little sliver of mountain lion habitat and, isolated that population. In the Santa Anas here, it's basically right in between I-5 and I-15 and then I-10 and then the ocean. So they literally are boxed in on all four sides. There's one remaining sliver of connectivity possibly across I-15 there, which there is a creek undercrossing, but for reasons we won't go into, lions don't use it. And most of the animals that we've documented in that area are going from the Santa Anas over to here, when what we really need is the opposite. We need them coming from this bigger population over to here. So yeah, that one's hemmed in. And then the yellow here, the San Gabriels and San Bernardinos, is this range here. We do know that this is I-15 again, that they can get across that road pretty readily. But you've got issues to the east. You've got desert. To the north, you've got desert. They can go up this way, but I-5 gets in the way. And for development reasons, they can't quite make that turn, it seems. And then you got I-10 to the south. So in all of these, it's almost completely human-induced population structuring. And then same up here in the Bay Area. So you get Highway 101 coming down, and I don't know why the GIS layer doesn't show up, but it completely connects right there. So yeah, you get isolation here as well. And so yeah, the small populations that you see are almost wholly or are wholly human caused. But there is some natural landscape structuring, like I mentioned here with the Sierras. And then also between the Sierras and sort of the basin and range country, there's sort of some natural structuring there as well. So yeah, great question. And I will say, this was all done with microsatellites. There's been some more recent work that I was involved in that used SNP, which is a much more, taking a finer tooth comb to the question. And we got almost, not the exact, but we got a very similar look at it. And still very much these isolated populations pop out. But with that, we were able to look at, stepwise, look at, clustering of 4, 5, 6, and step out a little bit and see just how all of the populations are related to each other. So, yeah.
I also just want to say that congratulations on all the collaboration you had with other researchers and the state of Nevada and everybody else. I know it's always difficult to do those kinds of things, and maybe you have some comments on how you got all that to work fairly quickly in such a large manner.
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe my accent helps a little bit. Whenever I first came to California, I still had a stronger Southern drawl. I don't have one really anymore. Not that I can tell. Maybe that makes me come across a little bit friendlier. But in all seriousness, I think it's just hat in hand. Figuring out what the problem is and trying to find people that you can work with to help address the problem, and just laying it out there like, here's what I have at my disposal. Here's the data sets. Here's the ability that I have, but I'm lacking in these areas. Here's how we can work together to collaboratively like reach this goal. Because, I would say even, you take a poll of all the people out there, I don't think there's anybody that doesn't want to see mountain lions on the landscape. I think everyone thinks that they're really cool, enigmatic animals, but it's just finding that common ground and working from that. Like I said, the rancher, and I grew up, with more a rural ranching background, but just sort of hat in hand, like, hey, you're a part of this as well. We need your play. We need you to stay on the landscape, because without you being on the landscape, it just all becomes tract housing. Or the conservancy, we need you all to help buy up these parcels of land when they do come up for sale, real quick before the real estate folks get wind of it, so that say that land can stay conserved and allow for a crossing structure to be built. we need the Department of Transportation biologist to get on board. Because, you know, y'all are the ones that are going to help us build a crossing structure. So I think just identifying common ground and where you can make progress together is key. But that common ground obviously is going to change with the people that you're talking to. But just being honest and being straight with people on what your intentions are and what you hope the outcome to be. Try not to pull the wool over anybody's eye. So.
Okay, well, we're past 4:30, so I think we'll probably call it there, but that was a good question to end on, because yeah, again, I think the really cool and informative part of this work is the collaborative nature of it. And yeah, I mean, what he was just talking about, bringing all those people together is hard in any state, but I think it's particularly hard in a state like California, where you've just got such a diversity of people and so many divergent viewpoints. So yeah, it's been a really cool thing to be a part of. So anyway, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll be back next week with another seminar about why soils matter.